There are four major indicators that we track and analyze in the monthly Application Security Statistics podcast. Window of exposure is an ultimate lagging indicator of how well the application and the application security program is performing. Window of exposure tells us about how long an application is vulnerable to exploits through serious, unaddressed vulnerabilities. We then look at vulnerability types. What are the most common vulnerability types and how are they changing? There are two other metrics we look at frequently: time to fix and remediation rate. We look at both these metrics by risk. How long is it taking to fix a critical vulnerability, and how many of these critical vulnerabilities are being fixed? Now, with that out of the way, let me frame the backdrop for our episode today. We now have data from over 6 months, and we can examine trends that we see in this data. So here's the backdrop from our analysis of this data. Applications are more vulnerable than last year. Time to fix serious vulnerabilities is increasing. Remediation rates are decreasing, and the types of vulnerabilities applications suffer from has not changed. Applications are now the path of least resistance for attackers to breach an enterprise. This is indeed our Kobayashi Maru moment. The question is, what will Captain Kirk do? Before we answer that question, let's do a quick run-through of some key metrics for this month.
Welcome to NTT Application Security's AppSec Stats Flash, the monthly podcast on the state of application security. Hosted by Setu Kulkarni with analysis from in-house security expert Zach Jones.
Let us start off with window of exposure. I want to remind you that window of exposure is tracked over the trailing 12-month period. Now we see that utilities continues to be at the top of the chart as far as window of exposure is concerned, with 66% of applications in the utilities sector having at least one serious exploitable vulnerability throughout the year. If it is any consolation, this number has actually dropped from 67% to 66% this month. Another sector to note is the sector called the management of companies and enterprises. Last month, we saw a 14% jump in window of exposure for applications in this sector. Now, this sector comprises of establishments that hold equity interest in other companies, also called holding companies. The sector also comprises of establishments that administer, oversee, and manage establishments of the company or enterprise and are normally undertaking strategic or organizational planning and decision-making within the enterprise. Education, retail, and wholesale trade, manufacturing, and healthcare, all of these industries have also seen an increase in their respective window of exposures. For example, the wholesale trade sector saw a 7% increase in the window of exposure, while education, manufacturing, and retail rose by 4%, and healthcare rose by 2%. Now, Zach, let me bring you in. Are there any underlying trends over the last 6 months that explain this increase in window of exposure in these sectors?
When we looked in detail at a few of the industries that you mentioned, what we saw was basically the aging of vulnerabilities. So window of exposure breaks down across buckets of the number of days an application is exposed. And for many of the organizations whose window of exposure for the full year saw an increase, the other buckets saw a decrease, meaning vulnerabilities are aging past the point of being vulnerable for an entire year. That's the overall theme that we see. The time it takes an organization to fix a vulnerability is large, so the exposure remains.
Right. And maybe we should double click into critical and high severity vulnerabilities. Has the time taken to remediate or fix critical and high vulnerabilities also increased over the last 6 months?
Over the last 6 months, our metrics on time to fix for critical and high vulnerabilities are either getting worse, meaning it's taking longer, or they're remaining relatively flat. If we look at critical vulnerabilities with the 3-month look back window, we're talking about starting in January at 194.8 days on average, ending in July at 202 days. So a slight increase. If we look at high vulnerabilities, it's an even larger increase. 197.4 all the way up to 246.4.
Wow, that's almost a 40 plus day increase, at least for high vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and since this represents the average, it is a little bit of a long tail effect, right? So it's not that all critical and high risk vulnerabilities are taking that long to fix. Some are fixed very quickly. It's an exponential curve. But there are some that go on for hundreds and hundreds of days, well beyond this average, that really drag it up.
Understood. And that is the reason why the window of exposure for these applications is so large. Now, on the other hand, there is some good news in the data that we see. Finance and insurance as sectors are doing much better, right? In the last month, we saw a drop in their window of exposure by 2%, meaning the number of applications that are vulnerable throughout the year with serious exploitable vulnerabilities has actually gone down in the finance and insurance sector. So, what's the bottom line here? I think the bottom line here is that window of exposure is an aggregate metric that depicts the overall state of application security in a given sector. And we find that industries like education, retail, manufacturing, healthcare, utilities continue to suffer more than other sectors like finance and insurance. Next up, let's take a quick look at vulnerability types. The top vulnerabilities are the same from last month and in fact have not changed at all since the beginning of this year. The top 5 vulnerability classes identified in the last 3-month rolling window remain constant, with information leakage, insufficient session expiration, cross-site scripting, insufficient transport layer protection, and content spoofing. Now, what I want to do is take a closer look at a particular vulnerability, HTTP response splitting. Now, if you remember in our May episode, we spent a bunch of time talking about HTTP response splitting. It's a serious vulnerability that allows attackers to modify the content of a website that a user sees. It can lead to impacts from reputational damage up to account takeover, depending on the affected site's functionality. And it's typically exploited by tricking the target user into clicking a malicious link or visiting a malicious website, which would then lead them to the vulnerable trusted website in a way that the attacker can control what the user sees or take actions on their behalf. Zach, I do want to circle back to this particular vulnerability because the rise of this particular vulnerability is no longer just a data point. It is a rising trend.
Absolutely. It continues to grow in terms of the number of vulnerabilities that a site exposed to at least one HTTP response splitting vulnerability has on average. And it's become almost an order of magnitude larger in the 3-month data than any other vulnerability class, which I found really puzzling because it's a fairly old vulnerability. Most programming languages and their application frameworks have been hardened to it a number of years ago. And so to see it really growing in its breadth across sites that are vulnerable to it was puzzling. So we went and hunted it down and were able to really get a better understanding of what's going on. So this isn't HTTP response splitting suddenly showing up across a really large number of sites. What this is a small number of sites who are vulnerable to HTTP response splitting everywhere on their site. And it ties in nicely with what we talked about in the May episode, being that modern HTTP response splitting is really an infrastructural vulnerability, not as it used to be an implementation in the code vulnerability. And that evidence is backed up by the fact that we were able to isolate 2 vulnerabilities in different open source pieces of software that these applications utilize as a part of their infrastructure. One of them has a CVE that's associated with it that we know of, and the other one we're still looking into identifying exactly what piece of software it is. But in general, what we're dealing with is infrastructure like reverse proxies that have a vulnerability. And when that reverse proxy is put in front of the website, we end up introducing that vulnerability across the entire breadth of that website, or even a handful of websites that are behind that infrastructure. So happy to have that sort of puzzle explained, that it aligns with what we understood about the modern makeup of HTTP response splitting. And we continue to look into the details of these vulnerabilities to understand, what the real root underlying causes are, so that we can potentially report those vulnerabilities to the vendors if they haven't already been, or just kind of tie up the puzzle for ourselves and understand where they're coming from. So one of the vulnerabilities that we identified is a CVE from 2020 in OpenResty server, right? Which is a server that you can implement to implement microservices routing architecture. And that CVE has been around obviously for almost a year and a half now. And what we're seeing is that when this out of date version of OpenResty is deployed, the entire site becomes vulnerable. The good news is the vulnerability was patched, and you can remediate it simply by upgrading to the newest version of OpenResty.
Now, how easy is it to do that, right? In principle, it sounds easy enough. Just upgrade to the latest version of OpenResty. But from a practical implementation point of view, how easy do you think that act of upgradation is? Because there might be many other dependencies that need to be satisfied for an application and its infrastructure to actually productively use OpenResty, the latest version.
Yeah, in this case, luckily, the technical path to an upgrade is very low. No breaking change from the last vulnerable version to the updated version that has the vulnerability remediated. Now, the human challenge and the management challenge, that's something that we see organizations struggle with continually, right? Knowing where you have this piece of software deployed, knowing what versions you're running, having owners that are responsible for upgrading that infrastructure, that's where the real challenge comes in.
That's a challenge that I'd like to throw out to all listeners of the podcast today. OpenResty, easy to remember. Go look at your application infrastructure, identify any OpenResty inherited OpenResty components in your application infrastructure, and make sure that you have the best version of OpenResty, which does not bring the HTTP response splitting vulnerability into the application implemented. So that's a challenge for all the listeners of the podcast today. Now, stepping back, I do want to kind of repeat the advice we had given out for fixing or avoiding HTTP response splitting in the May episode. First, use languages and application frameworks that are hardened to response splitting attacks. Robustly validate all information, especially user-related information, before it is placed into an HTTP response. Make sure that you've considered carriage returns and line feed characters while doing that. Ensure reverse proxy infrastructure is configured to properly handle malformed HTTP requests without returning user input in the response. So those are some of the suggestions we provided in the May episode, and I thought it'd be good to repeat them today. Now, a final word on time to fix. Time to fix has actually dropped by 3 days, from 205 days when we looked at it last month to 202 days when we looked at it this month. It's a small improvement. It's just 3 days, and it's not nearly enough. The bottom line is critical vulnerabilities still remain open on an average for 202 days. Now let's change gears to talk about one of the big macro trends from the last 6 months around window of exposure. What we find is almost a Dixonian story, reminding me of the tale of two cities. For some sectors, it's the best of times, and for some sectors, it seems to be the worst of times. When we look at 3 industries or sectors in particular, things are certainly moving in the right direction. Manufacturing, public administration, finance, and insurance. And I think very easy to explain each one of them. Manufacturing, obviously a lot of attention due to the supply chain attacks over the last 6 months. A lot of the manufacturing sector applications have been tested, and quickly remediated, reducing the window of exposure. Public administration, it almost feels like the whole executive order that the president released around cybersecurity placed a greater emphasis on applications in the public domain, federal and state run applications. And it seems very likely that an outcome of the executive order being put in place is an improvement in the cybersecurity profile of these applications. And last but not the least, finance and insurance. I think we've spoken about finance and insurance as a great example of the right things to do from a cybersecurity point of view. Finance and insurance have truly embraced agile software development. Being agile helps them address the vulnerabilities that are found in production at a much quicker pace. Zach, anything else you'd like to add around these particular industries, manufacturing, public administration, and finance, which have seen relatively large improvements in the window of exposure data over the last 6 months?
I think for all the industries that are seeing improvements, either over the short term, over the long term, it's really about them having established practices. And the magnitude of their change starts to get smaller and starts to consistently head in the right direction. And that's a piece of evidence that indicates a mature practice of application security improving over time rather than reacting to the latest news or the latest vulnerability they got reported, right? They're strategically acting on their program rather than specific instances of fires.
That makes sense, Zach. When I look at the data, manufacturing has probably seen the largest gains, right? A 12% improvement from the start of the year to now. While if you look at finance and insurance, a sector that has been consistently doing well, the gains are relatively small.
There also seems to be a bit of gravity. I was noticing this when I was looking at the trends over the last 6 months, that around the 50% line, when organizations get way above 50%, over the long term, they're maybe trending down to it. But on the flip side, organizations that get way under it seem to kind of have a little gravity coming back up to it. So I think overall, across industries, that's a real target line that if you can get below that line, you're really doing something well.
Let me double click on that for our listeners today. So, what Zach, you're saying is if your window of exposure is 50% or around 50%, and you're, if not going down, but at least remaining constant at 50%, there are some things that are working in your application security program.
Yeah, remember, application security, like all security, is somewhat of a competitive sport. So 50% sounds not great. And certainly there are some industries below that line, but there are many industries that are above that line, way above that line. And so it's a relative thing. All industries could improve, but that's not what we see, right? And so if you are maintaining that 50%, at least the data over the last 6 months shows that that's roughly the average, right? You're in the middle of the pack. You're not a specific target at that point.
Right. But on the other hand, when you look at sectors like wholesale trade, utilities, management or holding companies like we spoke about, and education, they've actually seen an increase in the window of exposure. When I look at the data, wholesale trade, for example, has seen a whopping 15% increase in window of exposure from when we looked at the data at the end of last year or early this year and to now. And that's a large number. Similarly, utilities, an 11% gain in the window of exposure. When we look at holding companies or management companies, there's a 10% gain. So is there a commonality in these industries from a behavior or trend point of view, Zach, that is contributing to this large increase in window of exposure for applications in these sectors?
One of the things I noticed that really falls in line with a thread of conversation we've been having through most of these podcasts is the digital transition of these organizations. And the organizations the industries that you highlighted seem to be industries that are not historically digital businesses. They are laggards in a sense in coming to the digital economy. And they're building more applications than they did in the past. They're testing more applications than they did in the past, thus finding more vulnerabilities they did in the past. And I think that's a big contributing factor that, in a sense, they're newer to the game of application security. And so having to learn the lessons, put in place the processes, the people to really be successful at application security. So we're seeing that challenge sort of play out in those industries.
Right. So irrespective of these industries, what we do find is the window of exposure is still significantly high. And that is really what I'd call the Kobayashi Maru moment for application security. Now, the question is, how do we fix this? Is there a silver bullet that we can take to this issue? And one of the things that we need to recognize is that in the data and the trends that we've been seeing over the last 6 months, while the window of exposure is increasing, the time to fix is increasing, the remediation rates are falling. One of the things that has remained constant is the types of vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities that are most prominent and most prevalent have actually not changed quite a lot. And therein, I think, lies the silver bullet. We have this massive opportunity to educate not just developers, but security operations teams and the organization as a whole about these top vulnerabilities that basically make their applications more vulnerable. And then once the education is implemented, there also needs to be an approach where you're fixing these vulnerabilities based on priority, right? For example, if you're finding a critical vulnerability in production, you've got to do everything possible to take that one vulnerability and run it through the software development lifecycle in an expeditious manner and get it fixed and pushed out to production. Now, Zach, does that kind of make sense? Is there anything else that we've seen in the data that offers kind of a silver bullet solution to this issue of applications being vulnerable throughout the year?
Well, I think the key word that you said there is priority. And I'll restate that to talk about risk-based priority. When we're measuring the window of exposure, we're only talking about serious risk vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities that are rated critical or high risk. And what we have seen throughout the months and in the trends of looking at remediation rates is that the theory of risk-based remediation doesn't seem to really play out in the data. We see inversions where lower risk vulnerabilities have higher remediation rates than higher risk vulnerabilities. We see downtrends in remediation rates in, for example, high risk vulnerabilities. Starting in January was at 50%, and in July is coming in at 38%, where we have maybe other risk vulnerabilities that are seeing a flat line or a slight increase in remediation rate. I think that's a really important focus for organizations. Once they've done their education about vulnerability types, how to remediate them, how the organization addresses them, you really have to be enabled to say, based upon our risk, we are going to have controls that make sure that we choose to remediate high risk, even if it's slightly harder than low risk that might be somewhat trivial to remediate. And that's a concerning data point that those high risk vulnerabilities are seeing such a reduction in remediation rate. And we need to focus on aligning those remediation rates with our theory of prioritization based on risk.
Now, are these high risk vulnerabilities or critical risk vulnerabilities harder to fix? And is that why the remediation rate is dropping? Or is there, in your view, other factors that are kind of impacting the fixing of critical or high vulnerabilities?
Certainly on the side of some of these we've talked about before on some of these infrastructural vulnerabilities, there's an ownership problem. So while maybe not technically hard to fix, the human process to get it done is a little bit harder. And then on a lot of the vulnerability classes that have remained on the list, pointing to cross-site scripting being one of them, that's an implementation thing that you have to go code up specific remediation, or you have to put in place a framework approach and refactor your application onto a framework with built-in protection. That's certainly not a light lift, right? That you have to put that through the software development and prioritization lifecycle, assign it out, and get the code pushed. So in some cases, harder might be an accurate description, but I think looking at the other side really might be where it's at, right? Many of these low risk vulnerabilities are just easy to fix. They're small things and they're easy to fix. And I can certainly put myself in the shoes of someone assigned several vulnerabilities and thinking from a quantity standpoint, let me just go knock out these ones that are simple changes.
Yes, and if I kind of rewind my career many years when I used to be a developer, I was actually measured on the number of Jira tickets I knocked out of the park, right? So I think your point is that once a vulnerability is codified into a bug or a ticket, developers often look at the quantity of tickets they're going to wrap up in a given day or in a given week or in a given release. And there has to be some level of risk-based prioritization that needs to happen even within the tickets that you're prioritizing for release. Is that kind of an accurate way of saying restating what you just said?
Absolutely. If not monetary, but maybe monetary, let's put a bounty on these things by risk, right? We've done that some in the vulnerability discovery space. Why not do it in the remediation space?
Absolutely. Now, with that, let's wrap up this month's podcast. And look, if there's one thing you take away from our analysis, it is this. Do everything you can to get your hands on your application security testing statistics from applications that you have running in production. The silver bullet for application security, we think, is hidden in this data. Identify the most prevalent, severe vulnerability or set of vulnerabilities and run an organization-wide campaign to eradicate that vulnerability. This is a topic that I'll dig deeper into in one of my next podcasts with the co-founder of Secure Code Warrior, Matthias. Until then, stay safe, and a huge thank you to Herman and Lauren, my producers who make these podcasts possible.
Thank you for listening to NTT Application Security's AppSec Stats Flash. To learn more, download the report or visit us on the web at www.whitehatsec.com.